I didn't take the job at a convenience store because I wanted to. I took it because bills don't wait, and there's only so much you can do when your rent's due and every other place in town has already filled their slots. The store was in Harrodsburg, Kentucky, a small, quiet town with a history that people only ever whispered about. There was a weird reputation tied to the place, but I figured it was all just stories. The job was easy, though. Night shifts, mostly restocking shelves and keeping an eye on the register. The only catch? The rules. When I interviewed with Mr. Feldman, the owner, he handed me a laminated sheet of paper. "Read these," he said, his expression stony. "Follow them to the letter. No exceptions." The list was long, typed in neat bullet points. As I read through them, I felt a nervous laugh bubbling up. It wasn't funny, though. Not really. 1. Never, ever lock the front door, even after hours. 2. If someone comes in wearing red after 3 a.m., don't look at their face. Just tell them you're out of stock of whatever they ask for and wait for them to leave. 3. You'll hear noises from the cooler in the back. Don't go in after 2 a.m., even if the noise gets louder. 4. If the lights flicker in aisle 3, leave the aisle immediately. Don't look at the ceiling. 5. If you see someone standing by pump number 5 who doesn't move for more than 5 minutes, call the number on the back of this sheet. Say the word visitor. Don't hang up until the line disconnects. 6. Every hour on the hour, check the security cameras. If you see a black screen on any of them, stay in the office until it clears. The list went on, each rule stranger than the last. At first, I thought this had to be a joke, some initiation thing for new hires. But Mr. Feldman didn't smile. His tired, sunken eyes stayed locked on mine. "If you're thinking of blowing these off," he said, voice low, "don't. It's not a joke. We don't hire people who can't follow directions." I nodded, not sure what to say. Part of me wanted to ask why the rules existed, but the cold, clipped way he spoke killed that urge. By the time I got home that night, I convinced myself it was some elaborate trick, a way to scare rookies or keep them on edge. But when my first shift rolled around, I realized it was anything but. The first few hours were uneventful. A couple of late-night customers came through. A guy in a trucker hat buying energy drinks, a woman in a hoodie who barely looked up as she paid for her cigarettes. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, and I tried to ignore the eerie quiet that settled after midnight. It was just a convenience store, I told myself. Nothing special. But then, at 2:15 a.m., the cooler started making noise. It was subtle at first, a faint knocking sound, like someone tapping on the inside of the glass doors. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of the fridges malfunctioning. But the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, sharper, like someone was banging their fist against the doors. I froze, the laminated rules burning in my pocket. "Don't go in after 2 a.m., the list had said. A chill crawled up my spine. I forced myself to focus on restocking the candy bars by the register, but the noise grew worse. It wasn't just knocking anymore. It was scratching, insistent and deliberate. My hands shook as I shoved the boxes back into place. I told myself it was just a raccoon or something, even though I knew it wasn't. I stayed behind the counter, heart pounding, until the noise stopped. The rest of the night dragged by, each hour slower than the last. At 3:05 a.m., a man in a red baseball cap walked in. I knew it wasn't him because of the cap. It was the way he moved, stiff and mechanical, like his joints didn't quite bend right. My throat went dry as he approached the counter. He didn't look at me. He didn't speak. He just stared at the shelves behind me, where the cigarettes were. We're out," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sorry." The man didn't react. He stood there for another few seconds before turning and walking out the door. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until it was over. I checked the cameras obsessively after that, watching for any black screens. None appeared, but the tension didn't ease. By the time my shift ended, my nerves were shot. I told myself it was a fluke, an overactive imagination combined with too little sleep. But when I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd barely scraped the surface of something much bigger and much worse. My second shift started the same way as the first. Quiet, uneventful. The kind of quiet that makes you notice every little thing. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights, the way the cash register drawer clicked when it opened, even the rustle of snack bags on the shelves when the air conditioning kicked on. I told myself it wasn't eerie, just ordinary. But as midnight crept closer, I found myself glancing at the laminated rules more often than I wanted to admit. I didn't like how the edges of the paper were frayed, like it had been handled by countless others before me. People who'd stood right here, in this same spot, gripping it tightly as though their lives depended on it. By 1 a.m., the store was dead. I kept busy rearranging items on the shelves, pretending not to think about the cooler. I even debated turning the small radio on, just for some background noise, but something told me it wasn't a good idea. The silence felt necessary, like the walls were listening. At exactly 2:10 a.m., the knocking started again. This time, it was louder, angrier, almost. I froze mid-step, staring down the narrow aisle toward the back of the store. My gut told me not to go near it, but it's hard to ignore something like that when you're alone. The sound echoed through the store, sharp and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't just a noise. It was a rhythm, like someone trying to get my attention. The rules flashed in my mind. Don't go in after 2 a.m., even if the noise gets louder. I backed away, my sneakers squeaking against the tile. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might echo too. I tried to focus on the counter, on the safety of the front of the store, but every step felt wrong. Like something unseen was watching, waiting for me to slip up. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I stood there, rooted to the spot, straining to hear anything else. But all I heard was the faint buzz of the lights overhead. I forced myself to move, to step back behind the counter where I could keep my eyes on the whole store. For the next 15 minutes, nothing happened. No knocks, no scratches. Just silence. I started to think it was over. At 3 a.m. sharp, the door chime rang. I snapped my head up, expecting to see a late-night straggler or someone stopping for gas. Instead, it was him, the man in the red baseball cap, the same one from the night before. He moved the same way, stiff and mechanical, like a puppet on strings. This time, he didn't head toward the cigarettes. He just stood in the middle of the store, staring down at the floor. His hands hung limply at his sides, and his head tilted slightly, as though he were listening for something I couldn't hear. I didn't speak. I didn't even breathe. After what felt like an eternity, he turned to face me. His face was obscured by the shadow of his cap, but I knew he was looking at me. I could feel it. My instincts screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. Something in his posture, his presence, held me there like a fish on a hook. "Do you have it?" His voice was low, raspy, barely more than a whisper. I blinked. "Whoa, what?" "Do you have it?" he repeated. His tone didn't change, but there was a weight to it now, like the words carried more meaning than they should. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my tongue useless. Finally, I managed to stammer, "We're out." His head tilted further, the brim of his cap casting an even darker shadow across his face. "You're lying." I felt my stomach drop. The rules didn't say what to do if he pushed back. They just said to tell him you're out of stock and wait for him to leave. But he wasn't leaving. "I'm not lying," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the store. The door chime rang again, and I let out a shaky breath. My hands were trembling as I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. It was over. At least, I thought it was. But when I glanced at the security cameras, my blood ran cold. He was still there, standing just outside the door, staring through the glass. His face was still hidden, but I knew he was watching me. The camera feed flickered, and for a split second, his image disappeared. When it came back, he was gone. I didn't sleep when I got home that morning. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there, unmoving, watching. I kept thinking about his words, the way he said them, like they weren't meant for me at all. "Do you have it?" I didn't know what he was looking for, but deep down, I knew one thing. Whatever it was, he wasn't done looking. By the time my next shift rolled around, I was on edge. I spent the entire day trying to convince myself that it wasn't a big deal, that I'd overreacted. Maybe the guy in the red cap was just some regular weirdo. Every small town has them, right? But no matter how much I tried to reason with myself, the knot in my stomach didn't go away. When I got to the store, Mr. Feldman was waiting for me. His eyes flicked up from the register as I walked in. "You look tired," he said. His voice clipped. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, didn't sleep much," I muttered, heading for the back room to stash my bag. I wasn't about to tell him why. "Just stick to the rules," he called after me. "You'll be fine." I didn't respond. I wasn't sure I believed him. The shift started slow, as usual. A couple of regulars came through, a trucker grabbing coffee and a local woman buying milk. They didn't stick around long, and by midnight, the store was empty again. I kept busy rearranging the chip display, pretending the tension in my chest wasn't building with every passing minute. At 1:45 a.m., I grabbed the laminated rules from under the counter and read them again. I'd practically memorized them by now, but I still felt the need to see them, like they were some kind of talisman. My fingers lingered over rule number 6. Every hour on the hour, check the security cameras. If you see a black screen on any of them, stay in the office until it clears. I hadn't seen any black screens yet, but the idea of it made my skin crawl. What would I even do if it happened? Just sit there, staring at the monitor, waiting for what? I told myself it didn't matter. It probably wouldn't happen. At 2 a.m., the cooler started up again. The banging and scratching were worse this time, louder and more insistent. I didn't bother looking. I just kept myself busy, focusing on anything but the sound. I knew better now. Ignoring it was the only way to get through the night. At 3 a.m., I braced myself for the man in the red cap to walk through the door, but the door stayed shut. The clock ticked on, and no one came in. The relief was short-lived, though, because at 3:10 a.m. I heard the chime. It wasn't the front door. It came from the back room. My heart jumped into my throat. The back room didn't have a chime, or at least it wasn't supposed to. The noise repeated, faint but clear, like a small bell being struck. My hand hovered over the phone, but I didn't know who I'd even call. The police? And say what? That the back room was dinging? I clenched my jaw and forced myself to move. Slowly, I crept toward the door, my sneakers making the faintest squeaks on the tile. The closer I got, the louder the sound became, rhythmic and deliberate. When I reached the door, I pressed my ear to it, straining to hear anything else. The sound stopped. I stood there, frozen, my hand on the doorknob. My breath felt too loud in the silence, each inhale shaky and shallow. I didn't want to open the door. Every instinct I had told me to leave it alone. But I couldn't just stand there either. I pushed the door open a crack, just enough to see inside. The room was empty. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning every corner. The shelves were lined with supplies, and the mop bucket sat where it always did. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt wrong, heavy, like the room was holding its breath. I backed out slowly, closing the door behind me. When I turned to head back to the counter, I caught a glimpse of the security monitor. One of the screens was black. My chest tightened. I stared at it, my mind racing. I couldn't tell which camera it was, just that it wasn't showing anything but an empty, suffocating void. I knew the rules. Stay in the office until it clears. But the problem was, the office was in the back, the same room I'd just left. I glanced back at the door. My legs felt rooted to the floor, but I knew I had no choice. Clutching the rules in one hand like a lifeline, I forced myself to move. The air in the back room felt even heavier now, like stepping into a dense fog. I shut the door behind me and locked it, my hand trembling as I fumbled with the latch. The monitor sat on the desk in the corner, its dim glow casting strange shadows across the walls. The black screen was still there, unmoving, unchanging. I sat down in the chair, my heart pounding in my ears. All I could do was wait. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I wasn't sure anymore. My eyes stayed glued to the monitor, watching for any flicker of movement, any sign that the screen was returning to normal. But it didn't. It just stayed black, an empty void that seemed to stretch out forever. Then, somewhere in the store, I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, dragging footsteps. They weren't coming from the front. They were closer, much closer. My pulse raced as the sound grew louder until it stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, gripping the rules so tightly the edges dug into my palm. The doorknob rattled once, twice, then went still. And then, just as suddenly as it had gone black, the screen on the monitor came back. The footsteps were gone. When the screen flickered back to life, I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My hand was still gripping the laminated rules so tightly that my knuckles were white. The camera feed showed the store's aisles, still and empty. Everything was back to normal, or at least, as normal as this place ever got. But the silence in the back room still felt wrong, heavy with the memory of those footsteps. I stayed in the office for another 10 minutes, my ears straining for any sound. When I was certain there was nothing else, I unlocked the door and crept back into the store. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter somehow, the humming louder, like the store was trying to pretend it hadn't just been crawling with tension. I went back to the counter, forcing myself to breathe evenly. The rest of the shift dragged on, uneventful but tense. I checked the cameras every hour like clockwork, half expecting another black screen or worse. But the store stayed empty, and the screens stayed clear. Until 4:50 a.m. That's when I saw him. The man in the red cap. He wasn't inside the store this time. He was standing by the gas pumps, specifically pump number 5, just like the rules had warned about. His back was to the store, and his posture was rigid, unnatural. He didn't move, not even a little. It was like he was frozen in place. The laminated sheet felt like it was burning in my hand as I scrambled to find the number on the back. My fingers fumbled with my phone, and I almost dropped it before finally managing to dial. The line rang once, twice, and then a calm, female voice answered. "Visitor?" she asked, her tone flat and disinterested. "Yes," I whispered, glancing nervously at the cameras. "Pump 5. He's not moving." There was a pause on the other end, and I thought for a moment the call had dropped. But then the voice came back, low and commanding. "Do not approach him. Do not acknowledge him. Stay inside, and do not hang up until I say it's safe." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. My hands were slick with sweat as I clutched the phone. "What is he?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Don't ask questions," she replied. "Just stay calm." The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his red cap tilted slightly, his hands hanging at his sides. The camera feed flickered once, and my heart jumped, but when it stabilized, he was still there. "What happens if he comes inside?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "He won't," the woman said firmly. "Not if you follow the rules." I stared at the screen, willing her words to be true. But then, something changed. The man tilted his head slightly, as though he were listening for something. My stomach twisted as his body twitched, his arms jerking in a strange mechanical motion. "He's moving," I whispered into the phone. "What do I do?" "Stay inside," she repeated, her tone calm but insistent. "And whatever you do, don't go near the windows." I dropped to the floor behind the counter, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. From my position, I couldn't see the monitors, but I could still hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above me. Every sound felt amplified. The creak of the floor, the hum of the cooler, even my own breathing. Then I heard the door chime. It wasn't supposed to chime. The door was supposed to stay locked, even though the rules said never to lock it. My chest tightened as the sound echoed through the store. Someone, or something, was inside. "Hello?" a voice called out. It wasn't the man from pump number 5. The voice was different, higher-pitched and frantic. "Is anyone here? Please, I need help." My stomach sank. I knew what the rules said. Don't look at their face. Don't engage. But this voice, it sounded human. It sounded scared. "Are you there?" the voice called again, closer now. "Please, I need to use the phone. My car broke down." I bit my lip, my mind racing. If I ignored them, would they go away? Or was this some kind of test? I stayed behind the counter, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "Are you okay?" the woman on the line asked, her voice breaking through my thoughts. "There's someone inside," I whispered. "It's not the guy from pump 5. It's someone else." "Do not respond to them," she said sharply. "Stay out of sight. This isn't what it seems." The voice in the store grew louder, more desperate. "Please, I know you're here. I can see your car outside. Just let me use the phone, okay? It's freezing out there." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I hadn't driven to work. My car was in the shop. Whoever, or whatever, this was, they were lying. The woman on the phone spoke again, her voice urgent. "They'll leave soon. Just stay where you are." I nodded, squeezing my eyes shut. The voice in the store grew louder, more agitated, but I stayed put. Minutes passed, and then finally, the door chime rang again. The store was silent. "It's safe now," the woman said. "You can get up." I rose slowly, peeking over the counter. The store was empty. The man at pump number 5 was gone, and so was the voice that had called out. But the tension in the air remained, thick and suffocating. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The sun was just peeking over the horizon when my shift finally ended. I was exhausted but too wired to sleep. The events of the night replaying in my head over and over. The man at pump number 5, the voice in the store, the phone call. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was just barely keeping my head above water, navigating rules I didn't fully understand. But I kept going back. I didn't have a choice. My next shift started like the others. Quiet, still, almost boring. I tried to distract myself by reorganizing the displays, counting stock, and keeping an eye on the cameras. But no matter how much I busied myself, I couldn't shake the unease that came with working here. It wasn't just the rules. It was the silence, the stillness, the way the air seemed to press in on me as the night wore on. At around 1:30 a.m., the cooler noises started again. I ignored them, keeping my focus on the register. This time, they didn't last long, just a few sharp knocks, and then silence. For a moment, I let myself believe it might be an easier night. Then, at 2:45 a.m., the lights in aisle 3 started flickering. I froze, the rules echoing in my head. If the lights flicker in aisle 3, leave the aisle immediately. Don't look at the ceiling. I wasn't in the aisle, but the sight of those flickering lights sent a chill through me. Aisle 3 was one of the narrowest aisles in the store, lined with cleaning supplies and canned goods. It always felt darker than the others, even in full light. Now, with the fluorescent bulbs buzzing and flickering erratically, it looked like something out of a nightmare. I glanced at the cameras, but the feed for aisle 3 was static. I couldn't see what was happening, but I didn't need to. I stayed rooted behind the counter, gripping the edge until my knuckles ached. The lights kept flickering, the buzz growing louder. It felt like the entire store was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My eyes darted between the aisle and the cameras, heart racing. And then, the static cleared. The feed for aisle 3 flickered back to life, and my stomach twisted. Someone, or something, was standing at the far end of the aisle. It wasn't the man in the red cap, but it wasn't any regular customer either. The figure was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It stood perfectly still, its back to the camera. I couldn't see its face. I grabbed the phone and dialed the number on the back of the laminated sheet. The woman answered after the first ring. "Yes?" "There's someone in aisle 3, I whispered, my voice shaking. The line went quiet for a moment. Then she spoke. "Stay calm. Do not enter the aisle. Do not look at the ceiling." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "That's not important," she said sharply. "Just follow the rules." I stared at the monitor, my hands trembling. The figure hadn't moved. It just stood there, its head tilted slightly, as if it were listening for something. The flickering lights cast strange, shifting shadows across its form, making it look almost liquid. "What do I do?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. "Stay where you are," she said. "It won't leave the aisle." My eyes flicked back to the screen. The figure still hadn't moved, but something about it was wrong. Its arms seemed to stretch longer with each flicker of the lights, its fingers brushing against the shelves on either side. I felt sick, the air in the store growing heavier with each passing second. Then, slowly, the figure began to turn. I slammed the phone down, heart pounding. I couldn't watch anymore. I dropped to the floor behind the counter, clutching the rules to my chest like a shield. My breaths came fast and shallow, the sound of my heartbeat drowning out everything else. The flickering lights continued for what felt like hours, but I didn't dare look up. I stayed curled behind the counter, my eyes squeezed shut. Finally, the buzzing stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. When I worked up the courage to peek over the counter, the lights in aisle 3 were steady again. I glanced at the monitor. The figure was gone. I didn't move for the rest of the shift. I didn't stock the shelves, didn't clean up, didn't do anything but watch the cameras and pray nothing else would happen. When the sun finally rose and the next shift worker came in, I left without a word. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing in the aisle, its limbs too long, its presence too wrong. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing for certain. The rules were the only thing keeping me safe, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could follow them. The next time I walked into the convenience store, something felt different. It wasn't just me. It was the air, the building itself. Everything seemed heavier, like the store was holding a secret I wasn't meant to know. The laminated rules sat behind the counter, taunting me with their simplicity. On paper, they were straightforward. In practice, they were suffocating. I almost considered quitting that night. I had my phone in my pocket, ready to call Mr. Feldman and tell him I was done. But rent doesn't wait, and no other job in Harrodsburg would hire someone with no notice. So I clocked in, shoved the rules in my pocket, and braced myself for another shift. For the first 2 hours, it was quiet. The cooler didn't knock, the lights didn't flicker, and the cameras stayed clear. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. At 2:30 a.m., a car pulled into the parking lot. I glanced up from the counter, expecting to see a regular customer or maybe someone passing through. But the car didn't park. It just idled by pump number 5, the headlights glaring into the store. The laminated sheet burned in my pocket as I remembered the rule. If you see someone standing by pump number 5 who doesn't move for more than 5 minutes, call the number. Say, visitor. But this wasn't someone standing. It was a car. I stared at the vehicle, the engine rumbling softly. The windows were tinted, too dark to see inside. I told myself it didn't count, that the rule didn't mention cars. But as the minutes ticked by, the unease in my chest grew heavier. At 2:35 a.m., the car's headlights turned off. The engine cut out a second later. The silence that followed was deafening. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I reached for the phone. Before I could dial, the driver's door creaked open. A man stepped out. He wasn't wearing a red cap. He wasn't wearing anything that stood out at all, really, just jeans and a hoodie. He walked slowly toward the store, his movements stiff and deliberate. I gripped the counter, my pulse racing as he stepped inside. "Evening," he said, his voice flat. "Hi," I managed to reply. My mouth felt dry, the words catching in my throat. He didn't move toward the shelves or the register. Instead, he just stood there, his hands in his pockets, staring at me. "Slow night?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, forcing a weak smile. "Not much traffic around here this time of night." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "You work here long?" "Not really," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Something about him set my teeth on edge. He wasn't doing anything overtly threatening, but there was something in his eyes, something too sharp, too aware. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward the back of the store, disappearing down an aisle. My heart pounded as I watched the cameras, tracking his movements. He wandered aimlessly, not picking anything up, just walking. And then, at 2:40 a.m., the lights in aisle 3 started flickering. My stomach dropped. He was standing in the middle of the aisle, his face tilted toward the ceiling. The rule screamed in my head, "Don't look at the ceiling." But he was. And the longer he stood there, the more wrong it felt. "Sir?" I called, my voice shaking. "Can I help you find something?" He didn't answer. He didn't even look at me. He just stayed there, staring upward, his body swaying slightly like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Sir?" I tried again, louder this time. Finally, he turned. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Do you hear it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" I asked, my pulse racing. "The sound," he said. "It's everywhere." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to decide what to do. He was breaking the rules, staring at the ceiling, acknowledging whatever was in aisle 3. I didn't know what the consequences would be, but I knew they wouldn't be good. "Maybe you should leave," I said, trying to sound calm. "It's late, and—" The cooler started knocking. The sound was louder than ever, like something was slamming against the doors with all its strength. The man's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes widening. "It's coming," he whispered. "What's coming?" I asked, my voice trembling. Before he could answer, the door chime rang. A second man walked in. He was wearing a red baseball cap. My blood ran cold. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the man in aisle 3. He just walked toward the counter, his movements stiff and mechanical. My throat felt like it was closing as he stopped in front of me. "Do you have it?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. I couldn't speak. My mind was screaming at me to follow the rules, to say the words and make him leave. But my body wouldn't listen. I was frozen, trapped in the moment. The man in aisle 3 started screaming. It was a sound I'll never forget, high-pitched and raw, like pure terror given voice. He stumbled out of the aisle, his arms flailing as though he were trying to fight off something invisible. The man in the red cap didn't react. He just stood there, waiting for my answer. "Do you have it?" he asked again, his tone unchanged. I don't know what you mean," I stammered. The man in the red cap tilted his head slightly, and for the first time, I saw his eyes. They were hollow, empty, like looking into a void. My legs buckled, and I gripped the counter to keep from falling. "You're lying," he said softly. And then, the lights went out. The store was plunged into darkness. The fluorescent lights, the security monitors, the buzzing hum, all of it was gone. The only sound was the blood pounding in my ears. My hands gripped the counter so tightly that my knuckles ached, and I strained to hear anything in the oppressive silence. The man in the red cap didn't move. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him, his presence like a cold weight pressing down on the room. The other man, the one who'd been in aisle 3, had gone completely silent. I didn't know where he was or if he was even still in the store. "Do you have it?" the red-capped man asked again. His voice was softer now, almost gentle, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I don't know what you're talking about," I whispered. The air felt heavy, suffocating. I couldn't see him, but I felt his gaze, cold and unrelenting. The darkness seemed alive, pressing in around me, crawling along my skin. My heart raced as I fumbled for the laminated rules, clutching them like a lifeline. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, dragging against the tile floor. They didn't belong to the man in the red cap. He wasn't moving. They were coming from the back of the store, where the cooler was. Each step echoed, growing louder and closer, and I realized with a sickening certainty that something else was in the store with us. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a faint, scratching sound came from behind me. My breath caught in my throat. It was coming from the office door. The laminated rules flashed in my mind. If the lights flicker in aisle 3, don't look at the ceiling. If someone stands at pump number 5, call the number. If a black screen appears, stay in the office until it clears. But this wasn't in the rules. None of it was. I didn't know what to do. "Please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I don't know what you want." The man in the red cap shifted slightly. I couldn't see him, but I could feel the air move around him, a faint ripple in the suffocating stillness. "You're lying," he said softly. The scratching behind me grew louder, more frantic. It was like claws dragging against the wood, sharp and insistent. My body froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. And then the door burst open. The man who'd been in aisle 3 stumbled out, his face pale and contorted with terror. His eyes darted wildly, unfocused, like he was looking at something I couldn't see. "It's here," he gasped. "It's here." I didn't have time to react. He lunged for me, grabbing my arm with a strength that didn't match his frail appearance. His fingers dug into my skin, his eyes wide and desperate. "You have to stop it," he shouted. "You have to—" Before he could finish, his body jerked violently, as though something had yanked him backward. His scream echoed through the store, raw and guttural, before it was cut off abruptly. And then he was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. I collapsed to the floor, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. My arm throbbed where the man had grabbed me, and I could feel the sticky warmth of blood trickling down my skin. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know what had happened. The man in the red cap spoke again, his voice calm and steady. "Do you have it?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't even move. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no logic here, no explanation. "Do you have it?" he repeated, his tone unwavering. "I don't know," I choked out. "I don't know what you want." He tilted his head again, and for a moment I thought I saw the faintest flicker of movement in the darkness. Something behind him, something tall and thin, with too many limbs. My stomach twisted, and I fought the urge to vomit. "You're lying," he said. And then he turned and walked out of the store. The lights flickered back on a moment later, blinding in their intensity. The security monitors crackled to life, showing the store exactly as it had been before. There was no sign of the man in aisle 3, no blood on the floor, nothing to suggest anything had happened. But I knew better. My shift ended at 6 a.m., and I walked out into the pale morning light, my legs weak and trembling. The parking lot was empty. There was no car at pump number 5, no sign of the man in the red cap. But I could still feel his presence, like a shadow following me. When I got home, I locked every door and window, pulling the curtains shut. I didn't sleep that day. I couldn't. All I could think about was his question, the way he'd said it, over and over again. "Do you have it?" I still didn't know what he was looking for, but I had a feeling he wasn't done looking. The next shift was going to be my last. I decided that before I even walked into the convenience store, whatever was happening here, whatever these rules were trying to protect me from, it wasn't worth it. The laminated sheet might have kept me alive so far, but I wasn't willing to test my luck any further. I'd give my notice and be done with this nightmare. When I arrived, the store felt different again. The air was colder, heavier, and there was a strange stillness that made my skin crawl. The laminated rules were sitting on the counter, just as I'd left them, and I couldn't help but stare at them. They felt like a curse more than a lifeline now, each bullet point a reminder of how close I'd come to breaking them. It wasn't long before the cooler started knocking again. This time, I didn't even flinch. I just stayed behind the counter, clutching the rules like a lifeline and counting the minutes until morning. At 3 a.m., the door chime rang. I looked up, expecting to see the man in the red cap or something worse. But it was just Mr. Feldman. He stepped inside, his expression as unreadable as ever, and locked the door behind him. "You shouldn't be here," I said, my voice shaky. "Sit down," he interrupted, his tone flat. I hesitated, but obeyed, sinking onto the stool behind the counter. Mr. Feldman walked over to the security monitors and stared at them for a long moment. The cameras were clear, the store quiet, but his shoulders were tense. "You're quitting," he said without looking at me. I swallowed hard. "Yeah." He nodded, still watching the screens. "I don't blame you. Most people don't last this long." "What is this place?" I asked. The question had been burning in my mind for days, but I hadn't dared to ask it until now. What's with the rules? The man in the red cap? All of it? Mr. Feldman sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. For the first time, he looked tired. Really tired. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. He turned to face me, his eyes dark and serious. "This place. It's a crossroads. A thin spot between worlds. Things come through sometimes. Things that don't belong here." I felt a chill run down my spine. "And the rules?" "They're to keep you alive," he said simply. "This store has been here a long time, and so have the rules. I don't know who wrote them originally, but they work. As long as you follow them." "And the man in the red cap? What does he want?" Mr. Feldman's jaw tightened. "He's looking for something. Or someone. I don't know what exactly. But you don't want to be the one he's looking for." I shivered, my mind racing. "And the guy from aisle 3? What happened to him?" Mr. Feldman's expression darkened. "He broke the rules." A heavy silence fell between us. I didn't know what to say, what to think. This wasn't just a bad job or a creepy store. It was something bigger, something I couldn't begin to comprehend, and I wanted no part of it. "I'm leaving," I said finally. "I can't do this anymore." Mr. Feldman nodded. "Fair enough. But before you go, there's one last thing you need to do." I frowned. "What?" He pointed to the security monitors. One of the screens was black. My stomach dropped. "No," I whispered. "I'm not." "You have to," he said, his voice firm. "You're still on the clock. You're responsible." I stared at the black screen, my heart pounding. The darkness felt alive, like it was reaching through the monitor, pulling me in. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something in Mr. Feldman's tone made me pause. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Go to the office," he said. "Stay there until it clears. And whatever happens, don't look back." I didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to leave and never come back. But I knew I couldn't. Not yet. I stood slowly, the laminated rules clutched in my hand, and made my way to the back room. The door creaked as I opened it, the air inside cold and still. The security monitor in the office showed nothing but static now, the black screen gone. But the unease in my chest didn't ease. I sat down in the chair, staring at the monitor, and waited. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The static didn't change, but the air in the room felt heavier, like something was pressing down on me. My breathing was shallow, my fingers gripping the edges of the rules so tightly they crumpled. Then, the lights flickered. I froze, my eyes locked on the monitor. The static wavered, and for a moment I thought I saw something. A shape, a figure, just on the edge of the screen. My heart raced as I leaned closer, trying to make it out. The figure moved. It was tall and thin, with 2 long limbs and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It stared directly at the camera, its head tilting unnaturally, its mouth stretching into an impossible grin. And then it spoke. "Do you have it?" The monitor went black again. I never went back to the store. I didn't quit properly. I just didn't show up for my next shift. I don't know what happened to Mr. Feldman, or the man in the red cap, or the thing in the monitor. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the cooler knocking. And when I do, I don't look. I don't answer. I just pray it doesn't find me.